Hi, everybody. Steve Tarter here, another edition of Tarter Sauce, and we dragged Bill Knight back here into the studio. It doesn't seem like you were here that long ago, but hey, you're always doing something. You're always involved with something. Tell us what this project is. This is a film that you're aware of. I think you know a lot about it. It's going to be on Channel 47, WPBS. Eventually.
And I think it's supposed to be later this month or early February, and then it'll repeat depending on the, moods of the network.
Right. It's a documentary. We can still use that term.
Sure.
Rainbow Coalition. Tell us about the Rainbow Coalition, because I think some people may think,
Isn't that Jesse Jackson?
Yeah. Well, what is that?
Actually, he seized the title when he had Operation Push,
Right.
and then he combined it with Rainbow Push.
Oh.
But actually, it stems from the late 60s in Chicago, and the documentary is called The First Rainbow Coalition, when led by the Black Panthers that were very active in Chicago, they began to align themselves with a former street gang, the Young Lords, that became more of a community organization, Hispanic, mostly Puerto Rican, and the Young Patriots, which were mostly people who had moved to Chicago for jobs from like Appalachia or the Deep South, and they were called the Young Patriots, as I said, and they used.
Was it a gang?
No, they were mostly a community organization.
Okay.
Very kind of political, but they had a Confederate flag as their emblem.
Wow.
And so,
what a coalition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it makes for some interesting visuals.
Yeah.
And the documentary talks about eventually, first, the Black Panther said, this will work out great, but you have to renounce racism. And they said, oh, of course, this is our heritage, which is kind of interesting. But eventually, the Young Patriots said, let's do away with the Confederate flag. So, it was 50-some years ago.
Foisted upon them. They did that themselves.
Yeah, right, yeah. And the leader talks about it. So it's interesting. We're going to show this at ICC's Arbor Hall on Thursday, January 16th, 7 o'clock. And I think it's an opportunity, it's not just
that's
history.
The North Peoria
on University.
ICC, yeah.
University
Just so
Street.
people know, yeah.
So it's part history, but it's part relevance to today. And there are a lot of local angles, oddly enough. Mark Clark is mentioned. He was the Peoria Black Panther activist who was killed with Fred Hampton in Chicago, and that was tied directly to police and FBI and really the Mayor Daley power structure on reacting to
that
this
was in '69, right? Yeah.
To reacting to this increasingly influential coalition. So.
And I know I have sort of vague memory of it, but in reading since then, the feeling was that these guys were, and I'm sure the film will spell it out much better, but they're basically sleeping in a Chicago apartment, and the police burst in.
Yeah,
and
an infiltrator came out later with a lawsuit, told the police which bedroom to target, and initially, and the film goes into this a little bit, probably the last 10 or 15 minutes, the police initially, organized by Edward Hanrahan, kind of a notorious Daily Machine person, said, oh, it was a gunfight. It was a fuselage of bullets flying.
So met with fire.
And in fact, the Tribune of the Daily News, mainstream reporters went down there, and there was one bullet apparently fired from the apartment, and hundreds in the apartment. It was, it was an assassination more than a gun battle.
Right.
And looking back, a lot of the impressions people now have of the Black Panther Party is they're violent, revolutionary. Well, kinda, but they were also very attuned to neighborhood issues. And this Rainbow Coalition expanded their breakfast program. They started free clinics. Housing issues were really big. And there's a lot of moving interviews, both current and archival, that demonstrate that, let's set aside these racial differences because we have so much in common that we're dealing with and we're trying to trying to cope with on a daily basis.
Is this in your mind, because you and I went through this period ourselves in probably different places, but is this an example of the 60s? I mean, I know that's a horrible generalization, but there was an attitude, and it's hard to explain now, just as it is, I think when the Vietnam War documentary came out, it was, and they focused on the division in the country, and not just the military aspect of it. And it's difficult to convey to somebody. There was a different attitude about things. I mean, it was. I know there was a split, a generational split, but does the film kind of pick up on that as far as, you mentioned the Black Panthers, and people were, and some people were afraid just on the basis of, you've got black guys carrying guns, openly.
Yeah.
What's your thought?
Yeah, what was the anecdote about in California, open carry was legal, and at a certain point, the legislature in California, Ronald Reagan was governor then, was having a state house debate about controlling guns, and Black Panthers, a contingent of them, showed up at the Capitol armed, didn't threaten anybody, but they were
carrying arms.
open. And, it kind of backfired from that point of view, because the legislature was convinced, oh, yes, let's control this. We don't want to have activists or radicals armed on the streets. And the Black Panthers emerged out of Oakland, California. It was originally called the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, because there was a lot of problems in the Bay Area with police brutality. And, keep in mind, not to belabor the history, but in the 60s, the federal government was Democratic, Kennedy and Johnson, until 68. So this isn't really a partisan issue.
Right.
Democrats were there, but Chicago, and the documentary uses a clip from Martin Luther King, was the most segregated city in the United States. And he says, this is nothing compared to, Montgomery, Alabama is nothing compared to the problems in Chicago.
Wow.
So these groups said, let's put aside the racial differences, because there are a lot of problems we have. We have our identities, that's fine. But look at the, things that there's a mutual interest here that we could work together. And
you mentioned it at the beginning, the fact that, this is one part history, focusing on the first Rainbow Coalition, which is the film coming out that Bill's mentioned is going to play at ICC on 16th?
Yeah, Thursday the 16th.
Thursday at 7?
7 o'clock.
Aside from that, it's also kind of a, here we are in 2020, all over the map. I mean, I know the Democrats are trying to find a candidate, and, you got Trump in the White House and all this disturbance. There might be a time for coalition again. I mean, it seems like, not to say focused against one party or another, but just to get, as you say, mutual interests served.
Yeah, in fact, after the screening, we have a panel discussion, which is kind of another way that we want to continue the conversation. One of my oldest friends, Michael James, who was involved with a Chicago group called Rising Up Angry, and unlike the Appalachian transplants, they were mostly whites, poor whites, but they called themselves greasers. So they would have these kind of leftist diatribes in their newspapers, but features on hot rods as well. He's going to be one of the panelists. He's coming down from Chicago. We have Sonny Garcia, who's from Illinois People's Action, Susan O'Neill, who's with the National Organization of Women and Indivisible, and Chris Wade from the NAACP. And they're going to talk about, diversity is good, but unity is good, and there's some solidarity issues. And there's problems, you don't want to completely sacrifice your main issue in order to sublimate yourself for the convenience of another party. Well, but there's some common ground.
And Peoria is not probably unlike many other cities. Sometimes you can spend too much time fighting, over you want your deal and not their deal, but there's no deal unless some people sometimes get together. It seems like compromise has become a dirty word.
Yeah.
I mean, across the board.
In fact, I think it was before you started at the paper, but when I was with the Newspaper Guild Union in the 80s, I think it was, we reached out to a union, Communication Workers, which the Newspaper Guild eventually absorbed into. they had a program called Jobs with Justice. And the whole theme was coalition within labor. And there was a lot of kickback, like some unions said, well, we don't want to do that. The building trades doesn't want to do UAW help. But the theme was, I'll be there. You know, if you're involved with Jobs with Justice and somebody, carpenters have a dispute, then teachers should show up as well. It's not just we're in these little silos.
Right.
And I think that's the situation the country's in now. We're in these little convenient, comfortable silos, and we don't want to break out, whether it's, you know, I watch Fox News and nothing else, or I go to Facebook and I see what I want to see and nothing else.
Yeah.
You know, coalitions have to break through that barrier, and the first Rainbow Coalition showed a dramatic success in doing that. Identities are fine, but those should be set aside when there are other issues.
You know, and I'm thinking of that because that's interesting. We talk about the Rainbow Coalition bringing Hispanic, Black, or white, and probably others. I don't know if women fit in there as a group, or they were just part of those others.
The American Indian movement was involved. And,
It just seems like if you were to propose that now, or something like it with similar groups or other groups, the feeling would be, oh, no, that won't work. You know, because we're all so defined. You know, we have our own defined way of doing something, and I can't be over here worrying about your problems. You know, I've got my own. You know, and I think
protect your agenda.
Yeah. And I think that was, again, I'm going back to sort of I'm hopeful I'm not being, you know,
Date
sometimes.
yourself.
Well, I'm dating myself. I know that, but sometimes you glorify the passion of the time without seeing some of the dark side. But I think the one thing that, and I'll say the '60s, but I didn't realize it flowed into the '70s. There was an openness to trying something, whether it was drugs, which of course could be a problem, or, you know, the idea of putting the material stuff aside. You know, there was just a general flow of, I mean, look at the music. Experimentation. I mean, you can pick out almost any area, and I just don't know why that stopped. You know, I mean, if somebody would say, well, there's a natural reaction to it, and you know, Reagan came along after that, and we had the '80s, and disco came along after, you know, the Beatles. But I mean, so I suppose there's all kinds of things here. But I would be interested in how that goes in the discussion group, where they bring it to all right, here we are in 2020. We've just seen this documentary. Could that happen here? Could that happen anywhere, Chicago, wherever? I mean, because it just seems like the power group, and again, we're getting political here, but the power group that's in power now has obviously benefited from divide and conquer.
Oh, yeah. And they're really good at it.
Yeah, really good. And those Russians are good at it, too, from what we hear.
You know, I saw a recent chart that showed the economic gains of U.S. society since World War II. And despite the racism and segregation in the 50s and 60s, economically, most of the, what they call it, quintiles, the 20% segments of the country, benefited about the same rate until about 1979 or 80. Maybe a coincidence, but that's when the Reagan era began. And since then, it's like the top 1/5 has escalated dramatically. So inequality, economic inequality, has really become the standard now. And it's difficult to look at that.
Almost accepted. I mean, it's a baffling thing because
it's like, oh, well, you know.
Yeah, that's the way it is. No, it wasn't the way it was. I mean, you'd always have this conflict, but, well, I mean, one could, and we're throwing things out here, and obviously there'll be those that want to say, well, hey, let's look at this. So understand that we're just sharing ideas. But farmers, and, you know, this is a huge agricultural area here in Illinois, but farmers seem to be more than happy, or apparently they voted for Trump. And yet, one of the first things he did with this tariff thing was really hit him hard where it really hurt. Now, we'll see how that is resolved, but yet there seems to be an acceptance that, it's not in my own interest, but I'm willing to maybe
give it a pass.
They like something else they see there, and I'm speaking for people that I haven't talked to, so we'll have to have somebody come on and give me hell, but that's all right. But what do you think? I mean, is there going to be, what do you see as a benefit for this program?
For the documentary?
Yeah, for the documentary. It's
I think just to start the conversation. Yeah, start the conversation. In fact, they're not going to be on the panel, but one person who's interviewed in the film is Jack Ryan, the former FBI agent
Yeah.
from Peoria, who
Right.
quit shortly before his scheduled retirement because he objected to the FBI focusing too much on nonviolent activist groups rather than organized crime or bank robbers or whatever. And he's going to be at the screening, so I'm sure he'll have comments as
That'd be
well as
great.
clarifying maybe
Yeah.
what's in the documentary. And members of the Mark Clark family got in touch and said they're going to be there too. They recently
Nice
had
Peoria
a
connection
commemoration.
there to
Right.
that.
And that's the thing. History isn't just not only something in the book or a Ken Burns documentary, but it's something that you can make connections with now and with your local community. I mean, it's amazing how much overlaps, and it's not just Peoria. You could probably do this at South
Sure.
Bend, Indiana, or,
Right.
or wherever. So there was one quote from a guy that's in the feature, a former Black Panther named Aaron Dixon, who said, "It just felt natural that you would struggle with other people who've been marginalized and who have been held down, who've been oppressed." So it's that step that you begin to say, is this possible, where you might realize that this isn't that outrageous. It might be natural to find some common ground.
And it strikes me that if that becomes an attitude again or an openness, that isn't just an issue for. I don't want to minimize it because racial equality is a huge issue and it's certainly important here because this also is you mentioned Chicago being divided, so too is Peoria.
Sure.
I mean, and we've got all these statistics or whatever that attest to that. But the point is, that could just help in a lot of different ways. People just understanding, hey, I'm not you and I may not agree, but I'm not opposed to you. As ways when you go on Facebook or something, and there's this like wall that
Yeah.
exists between people.
Yeah, we can't unfriend the community. We live in a society.
Yeah.
So,
It's become too much. I think I do not to put it all on the internet or anything like that because I think there's many factors.
And I got to say that this coalition was, I mentioned earlier, they had a free breakfast program in clinics, and they started the People's Law Clinic, which was attorneys that were advocating for some of the issues. There were faith groups, churches that were involved with this. The Students for Democratic Society got involved later. What was their offshoot called? Join, Jobs or Income Now. But it was not, they were not picking up arms and attacking people. These were occasionally direct actions. There was young lords took over a police meeting where they were talking about police issues, and they just took over the meeting at a district, which kind of attracted the Black Panthers. Like, who are these people?
Yeah.
And that was one of the entry points. But it was nonviolent for the most part. In fact, you mentioned in passing the Weathermen in the 1969 Days of Rage. First Rainbow Coalition totally withdrew from that and said, no, that's going to be divisive and it's not productive. So they were nonviolent, direct action. They were getting people's faces, but they weren't.
Right.
They weren't attacking. They weren't, the cliched armed revolutionaries.
Which, I think that's a good recognition, I think, by the organizers because that's probably what made it effective for the short time that it was, or showed that it can happen. But, how do you keep something like that afloat is probably another issue. Maybe the film brings that out, that,
Well,
the
it talks
problems.
about after the killing of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, the coalition didn't immediately disband, but several of the prominent activists, literally, there were rewards out for their arrests, so they had to kind of disappear or leave Chicago, or at least leave their apartments.
Yeah.
And it contributed to the eventual demise, but it changed because after the existence of the first Rainbow Coalition, they realized the organizing power of that community group. So they talk about, they took the lessons of that short period, 4 or 5 years, and registered tens of thousands of people to vote. Were instrumental in Harold Washington's election as Chicago mayor, Cook County Clerk David Orr, and eventually former Congressman Luis Gutierrez and Chuy Garcia, who's a current congressman. And arguably, you can make the connection to I think there are 5 Democratic socialists now on the Chicago City Council. You know, when Harold Washington was mayor, there were so many elements of the Mayor Daley machine that even African Americans on the city council wouldn't buck the Daley machine.
Yeah.
So what do they call it? The council wars.
Yeah.
You know,
It's so
with
entrenched.
Washington.
I mean,
yeah.
that's the reality. Well,
And
Bill-
you know, I got to say the director too. What's his first name? Ray Sanesteban was a longtime documentary filmmaker for decades. He's not like Ken Burns, although he uses a lot of archival footage and intersperses that with current interviews, including Jack Ryan and some of the Black Panthers that were involved. But it's very poignant in several places. People who think, you know, that really was a special moment in time. And there's an effective use of both songs from that period and kind of more Ken Burns-ish instrumental
I don't know if
touches
that's
as well.
a phrase, Ken Burns-ish. The journalist here. Well, Bill, we're almost at, well, we are out of time. Give us a rundown again. It's
7 o'clock on Thursday, January 16th.
at the Peoria ICC.
On University.
Yep.
And it's about an hour long, and then after that we'll have about a half-hour discussion with these panelists from Chicago and Central Illinois.
And some interesting people will be there. I mean, people from this area and also from outside the area, but
Yeah.
experts. Well, very good. Well, and then this might be shown later on public television.
Sure, on Channel 47. And it reminds me when you and I used to do Apollo Theater, you think, okay, we have To Kill a Mockingbird, we'll sell out. We'll have another film, we'll have 3 people show up.
You remember that, yeah. I remember that all too well. I always remember too, and then we'll close on this. When I overstepped, and which was right away, 2005, I found some stuff. So that's been 15 years now. That we did a robot film festival, and I thought, you know, grandiose planning. Well, we had you introduced one. I can't remember. Would you remember your film you introduced?
Was it Metropolis?
It might have
Maybe,
been.
yeah.
We're testing our memories here, but anyway, there was one and I can't remember the film, but we thought we had somebody from Methodist, now Unity Point, talk about robotic surgery, and he was going to lead off, do 15 minutes, and then we'll run the film. Only problem was we have one person in the audience. So I went over and introduced the speaker to the audience, and then we actually went ahead and did it. But anyway, well, let's hope we have better attendance for your show at ICC. And thanks again.
Sure.
Okay, and Bill Knight.
Glad to be here.
We'll have you back and talk about all kinds of things because you're involved with so many different deals. We need to hear about them. And that's all for Tarter Sauce. We'll see you next time.
PeoriaLife.com